Hi, I'm Jenny. 2 weeks ago, I stood in my parents' living room as they calmly announced they were giving my grandfather's entire estate to my brother. David has a family to support, my mother said with that dismissive smile I've known my whole life. You'll understand someday. What they didn't know was that Grandpa Harry had made other arrangements. The moment Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and pulled out that second envelope, I watched their certainty crumble. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just silence a room. It revealed a promise that had been kept for 30 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Tuesday. I was halfway through my shift at Springfield Community Hospital when my phone lit up with my mother's number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. 12 hours into a 14-hour shift, my patience for family drama was running thin. But some ingrained sense of obligation made me step into the break room and answer. Jennifer, we need you at the house on Friday at 2. Mr. Thompson is coming to discuss your grandfather's estate. My mother's voice had that clipped efficiency she used when delivering information she considered non-negotiable. No, how are you? Or, sorry to bother you at work. I leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 3 weeks. The funeral, the quiet sorting of Grandpa Harry's belongings at the old farmhouse, the way David had started talking about investment potential before we'd even held the memorial service. I'll be there, I said simply. Should I bring anything? A pause. Then, just yourself. David's already handled most of the paperwork. Of course he had. My brother, the financial advisor, always positioning himself as the responsible one while I was just the nurse who chose a caring profession over a lucrative one, as my father liked to phrase it. Right. See you Friday. I hung up before she could add anything else. Back at the nurse's station, my colleague Megan raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? You look like someone just told you they're discontinuing chocolate. I managed a smile. Family stuff. My grandfather's estate. I didn't elaborate. How could I explain the complicated dynamic of my family in the 5 minutes we had before rounds? How David had been groomed to take over the family legacy since childhood, while I was expected to find a husband who would provide for me properly. How I'd chosen nursing against my parents' wishes because I believed in helping people directly, hands-on, rather than managing their money. How Grandpa Harry had been the only one who'd ever really seen me. Want to grab breakfast after shift? Megan offered. I make an excellent sounding board, especially when mimosas are involved. I wish. Rain check? I need to drive out to the farmhouse before I crash. The farmhouse again? Didn't you just go out there last weekend? I nodded, gathering patient charts. There's still so much to sort through, and honestly, it helps me feel close to him. What I didn't say was that each visit felt like a countdown, like I was trying to memorize every creaking floorboard and sun-dappled window before it inevitably slipped away from me. The farmhouse had been in our family for 4 generations. The 2-story white clapboard with the wraparound porch where I'd spent every summer growing up, helping Grandpa in his workshop or reading for hours in the window seat while thunderstorms rolled across the fields. My grandfather had moved to a smaller house in town after my grandmother passed, but he'd kept the farmhouse, letting me stay there whenever I needed space. Some places hold our histories, he'd told me once. They remember who we are even when we forget. Now, with him gone, I knew what would happen. David would sell to the highest bidder, probably Greenwood developers who'd been eyeing the property for years. 12 acres just outside town limits was prime real estate now that Springfield was expanding. The farmhouse would be demolished, replaced by cookie-cutter homes with names like Orchard View, despite having neither orchards nor views. After my shift ended, I drove the familiar route out of town, past the newer subdivisions, until the road narrowed and the streetlights gave way to stretches of darkness broken only by my headlights. It was nearly midnight when I pulled into the gravel drive, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. I let myself in with the old key, not bothering with lights at first, just standing in the entryway letting the familiar scent wash over me. Wood polish, old books, and that indefinable something that simply meant home. Grandpa Harry hadn't spent much time here in recent years, but his presence lingered in every corner. Finally, I flipped on the kitchen light and set my bag down on the oak table where we'd played countless card games and done jigsaw puzzles on rainy days. The silence felt heavy, expectant, like the house itself was holding its breath. "I'm trying, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room. "I don't know how, but I'm trying." I'd spent weeks going through closets and drawers, organizing what could be donated and what held too much sentimental value to part with. But the task seemed endless, especially knowing that in the end, none of my efforts would likely matter. My parents had made it clear that as the financially responsible sibling, David would make the final decisions about the property. Moving. To the living room, I curled up in Grandpa's old armchair and pulled the crocheted afghan around my shoulders. Just a quick rest, I told myself, before heading upstairs to continue sorting through the bookshelves. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, morning light was streaming through the windows, and my phone was ringing. David's name flashed on the screen. "Jenny, where are you? Mom said you were working last night." I rubbed my eyes, disoriented. "I'm at the farmhouse. Fell asleep in the chair." A pause. "Again? Jenny, you need to stop doing this. It's not healthy, and honestly, it's a little weird. The place is going to be sold. You're just making it harder on yourself." The familiar irritation flared. "I'm clearing things out, David. Someone has to do it." "We could hire people for that." His voice had that patient tone he used when explaining simple concepts to difficult clients. "Anyway, I was calling to make sure you're still coming tomorrow. Mr. Thompson specifically asked if you'd be there." That surprised me. "He did? Why?" "Probably just being thorough. You know how these legal types are, crossing every T and dotting every I." There was a shuffling of papers on his end. "Just be there by 2, okay? And maybe wear something." Professional. I glanced down at my rumpled scrubs. "What, you think I'm going to show up in pajamas?" "I'm just saying this is important. The property is worth close to $1 million now with the new highway extension. We need to present a united front." I bit back a retort about who exactly would be benefiting from that $1 million. "I'll be there," I said instead, and ended the call. The rest of the day passed in a blur of sorting and packing. By evening, I'd filled my car with boxes for donation and had carefully wrapped the few keepsakes I hoped to hold on to. Grandpa's collection of hand-carved wooden birds, the antique compass he'd carried since he was a boy, the leather-bound copy of Thoreau he'd given me for my 16th birthday with pressed wildflowers still marking his favorite passages. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect early autumn day. I returned to my apartment to shower and change, selecting a simple navy dress that managed to be both professional and comfortable. I wasn't sure why I was bothering. No matter what I wore, my parents would find some subtle way to indicate it was lacking. As I fastened my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only piece of her jewelry that had come to me, I studied my reflection. At 32, I had my grandfather's eyes, that same shade of hazel that shifted between green and brown depending on the light. Old soul eyes, he'd called them. I wondered if he'd be proud of the woman looking back at me now, or disappointed that I hadn't fought harder for the things he valued. The drive to my parents' suburban home took 20 minutes, but it always felt like crossing into another world. Their neighborhood was all manicured lawns and tasteful landscaping, a far cry from my apartment near the hospital or the wild rambling garden at the farmhouse. I parked behind David's shiny black SUV, noting that he'd positioned it to partially block my usual spot. Some habits never changed, even in our 30s. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my purse and the small folder of papers I'd brought, mostly sentimental items I'd found at the farmhouse that I thought the family might want to see before decisions were made. My mother opened the door before I could knock, a practiced smile already in place. "Jennifer, right on time." She air-kissed my cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick. "David and your father are in the living room with Mr. Thompson." I followed her through the immaculate foyer into the formal living room, a space reserved for important occasions and rarely used otherwise. The furniture was stiff and uncomfortable by design, meant to discourage extended visits. My father stood as I entered, extending a hand as if greeting a business associate rather than his daughter. "Jennifer, good of you to join us." David sat on the sofa beside a thin, silver-haired man I recognized as Mr. Thompson, my grandfather's attorney for as long as I could remember. My brother wore a tailored suit despite it being Friday, his expression one of contained eagerness barely masking the calculation beneath. "Jenny," he nodded. "You remember Mr. Thompson." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The older lawyer stood, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he offered his hand. "Miss Miller, it's good to see you again, though I wish it were under happier circumstances. Your grandfather spoke of you often." Something about his gentle tone made my throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you. It's good to see you too." My mother gestured to an armchair positioned slightly apart from the main seating area. "Jennifer, why don't you sit there so Mr. Thompson can address us all?" I took the designated seat, noting that it placed me firmly on the periphery of the conversation, within earshot but clearly not central to the proceedings. Some things never changed. Mr. Thompson opened his briefcase methodically, removing several folders and arranging them on the coffee table. "Before we begin, I want to express again my condolences for your loss. Harold Miller was not just a client, but a dear friend for over 40 years. My father nodded impatiently. "Yes, thank you. We're all still adjusting, of course. But Harold was practical above all else. He'd want us to handle these matters efficiently." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from commenting. My grandfather had been many things: kind, thoughtful, occasionally stubborn. But practical, above all else, wasn't how anyone who truly knew him would describe him. "Of course," Mr. Thompson agreed mildly. "Well then, to business. As you know, I'm here to discuss the distribution of Harold's estate according to his wishes." My mother leaned forward slightly. "We've already discussed the broad strokes with David, of course. Harold made his intentions quite clear over the years." Had he? This was news to me. I glanced at David, who gave a small, satisfied nod. Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses. "I see. Well, as executor of the estate, it's my responsibility to ensure that everything proceeds according to the legal documents, regardless of any previous conversations." Something in his careful phrasing made me sit up straighter. My father waved a dismissive hand. Naturally. But we all know Harold's intention was for the family assets to pass through the male line. It's been that way for generations. He glanced at me, adding, "No offense, Jennifer, but your grandfather understood the importance of keeping the property intact, not divided." The familiar sting of exclusion washed over me, but before I could respond, my mother jumped in. "Jennifer's chosen a different path, one that doesn't involve managing property or investments. David has the experience and the family to consider." She smiled at me with rehearsed sympathy. "Darling, you're so busy with your nursing career. The last thing you need is the burden of property management." David cleared his throat. "I've already spoken with several interested parties about the farmhouse property. Given the current market and the zoning changes, we're looking at a significant opportunity. The proceeds would secure the family's financial future for generations." By family, of course, he meant his family, his wife Caroline, their 2 children, and any future additions. Not me, never me. Mr. Thompson had been watching this exchange silently, his expression giving nothing away. Now he placed his hand on a sealed envelope atop his stack of folders. "If I may proceed with the reading of the will?" My father gestured magnanimously. "Please do." The lawyer opened the first document with deliberate care. "This is the last will and testament of Harold James Miller, dated March 15th of last year." He began reading in a measured tone, outlining standard legal provisions and small bequests to various charities my grandfather had supported over the years. I half listened, my gaze drifting to the window where sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains my mother had installed last spring. Outside, a cardinal landed on the bird feeder, a flash of brilliant red against the green backdrop of the carefully trimmed hedge. My attention snapped back when I heard Mr. Thompson say, "Regarding the disposition of my primary residence in town and associated financial assets." My mother reached over to squeeze David's hand, a triumphant gesture poorly disguised as support. "I leave to my grandson, David Robert Miller, the sum of $100,000 and my collection of vintage woodworking tools, in recognition of his commitment to financial stewardship, and with the hope that he might discover the satisfaction of creating something with his hands." The smile froze on my mother's face. David blinked rapidly, like someone trying to process unexpected information. 100,000? My father repeated, his voice higher than normal. "But the house in town alone is worth twice that." Mr. Thompson continued as if there had been no interruption. "The remainder of my financial assets and my house in town I leave to be divided equally between the Springfield Historical Society and the Community Hospital Nursing Scholarship Fund, the latter to be named in honor of my late wife, Eleanor." My mother made a small, distressed sound. "This can't be right. Harold would never—" Mr. Thompson held up a hand, his expression firm for the first time since his arrival. "Please allow me to finish, Mrs. Miller." The room fell silent again, tension vibrating in the air like a plucked string. "As to the Miller family farmhouse and associated 12 acres, property that has been in our family for 4 generations." David leaned forward, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. This was the prize, the valuable land that developers had been salivating over for years. "I leave this property in its entirety to my granddaughter, Jennifer Eleanor Miller, who alone among my descendants understands its true value beyond mere dollars and cents." The words hung in the air for a long moment before chaos erupted. "This is outrageous." My father was on his feet. "Harold and I discussed this extensively. The property was meant for David." My mother turned to Mr. Thompson, her voice tight with controlled fury. "There must be some mistake. Harold was in his 80s. He wasn't thinking clearly." David simply stared at me, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and something darker. I sat perfectly still, certain I had misheard. The farmhouse. To me? It seemed impossible. A dream I would wake from at any moment. Mr. Thompson waited patiently for the initial outcry to subside before speaking again. "There is no mistake, I assure you. Harold was of perfectly sound mind when he updated his will last year. In fact, he specifically anticipated this reaction." He reached for the sealed envelope he had set aside earlier, breaking the wax seal that bore my grandfather's distinctive H pressed into it. From inside, he withdrew a letter. He asked that I read this letter in the event that his wishes were questioned. My father was still standing, his face flushed. "This is unnecessary. Obviously, we'll need to contest this will. Harold wasn't himself after Eleanor died. Anyone could see that." "Robert," Mr. Thompson said, using my father's first name for the first time. "I strongly suggest you listen to what Harold has to say before making legal threats you may later regret." Something in the lawyer's tone, a quiet certainty, made my father slowly retake his seat. David was already on his phone, presumably texting his own attorney. Mr. Thompson unfolded the letter, the paper making a soft, crackling sound in the strained silence. "To my family," he began, and I immediately recognized my grandfather's voice in the words. "If you're hearing this, then I've moved on to join my Eleanor, and you're now questioning my decision about the farmhouse." He paused, looking up briefly to make eye contact with each of us before continuing. "Robert and Patricia, I've watched with disappointment over the years as you've dismissed Jenny's choices and elevated David's simply because they aligned with your own values. Money is not the only measure of success, nor is ambition the only virtue worth cultivating." My mother made a small sound of protest, but Mr. Thompson continued without acknowledging it. "David, my boy, you have talents that have served you well in the financial world. But in your pursuit of wealth, you've forgotten what wealth is for. It's a tool, not a goal in itself. The tools I've left you are a reminder that creating has its own reward, one that can't be measured in dollars." David's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "And Jenny, my quiet, determined Jenny. You've chosen a path of service rather than accumulation. You visit the farmhouse not because of what it might be worth someday, but because of the memories it holds. You see its soul, just as you see the souls of those in your care." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to give my parents the satisfaction of seeing me emotional. The farmhouse has stood for over a century, witnessing the lives of our family. I cannot bear the thought of it being razed to build more soulless developments. Jenny will protect it, honor it, and perhaps find the peace there that has often eluded her. Mr. Thompson turned the page, his voice steady. "And now, to address the objections I know are already forming. Yes, I am of sound mind. Mr. Thompson has extensive documentation from my doctor confirming this fact. Yes, this decision is final. And yes, I have taken steps to ensure it cannot be easily contested." My father's expression darkened further, but he remained silent. Attached to this letter is documentation of the conversations I've had with David over the past 5 years regarding his plans for the property, specifically emails and recorded meeting notes with developers dating back to when Eleanor was still alive, negotiating the sale of land that was not yet his to sell. David went very still, the color draining from his face. "I've also included the survey David commissioned without my knowledge to subdivide the property, as well as the preliminary contracts he drafted with Greenwood developers while I was in the hospital last winter." I stared at my brother in disbelief. While Grandpa was in the hospital? The depths of his betrayal stole my breath. These documents have been notarized and copies filed with Mr. Thompson's office, as well as with Judge William Harrington, an old friend who would be most interested to hear about attempts to manipulate an elderly man's estate. Mr. Thompson looked up, his expression somber. "The reference documentation is indeed on file with my office and with Judge Harrington." My father slumped back in his chair, the fight visibly leaving him. My mother pressed her fingertips to her temples, eyes closed. "In conclusion," Mr. Thompson continued reading, "I love all of you, despite our differences. But love doesn't mean accepting behavior that harms others or betrays trust. Jenny alone has shown that she values the farmhouse for what it is, not what it could be converted into. She has earned this inheritance not through calculation, but through genuine care." The letter ended with a simple signature. "With hope for understanding, Harold Harry Miller." For several long moments after Mr. Thompson finished reading, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift to my parents from Grandpa Harry 35 years ago. Finally, David stood, straightening his jacket with a jerky motion. "This is unexpected," he managed, his voice strained. "I'll need to consult with my attorney about these allegations." "They aren't allegations, David," Mr. Thompson said, quietly. "They're documented facts, Your grandfather gave you multiple opportunities to be honest with him about your intentions. He was deeply hurt when you chose deception instead. My brother refused to meet anyone's eyes. I need some air, he muttered, and strode from the room without another word. My father looked years older suddenly, the careful facade of authority crumbling. Harold should have discussed this with us directly. He tried, Robert, Mr. Thompson replied, a hint of sadness in his tone. Many times, according to his notes, but you were convinced you knew better. My mother turned to me, as if suddenly remembering I was still in the room. Her expression was a complex mixture of resentment and calculation. Jennifer, surely you see this isn't practical. The property taxes alone on that land are already accounted for, Mr. Thompson interjected. Harold established a trust specifically to cover property taxes and maintenance costs for the next 10 years, giving Jennifer ample time to determine the farmhouse's future without financial pressure. I found my voice at last, though it came out softer than I intended. I don't want to sell it. I never did. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. Don't be naive. You can't possibly maintain that place on a nurse's salary once the trust runs out. I thought of the farmhouse, of the way sunlight spilled across the worn wooden floors in the late afternoon, of the apple trees Grandpa and I had planted when I was 9, now tall and bearing fruit each fall, of the quiet peace I felt there that I'd never found anywhere else. I'll find a way, I said, more firmly this time. The farmhouse stays in. The family. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat gently. If I may, there is one final item. He removed a small box from his briefcase and handed it to me. Your grandfather asked that I give you this privately, but under the circumstances, perhaps now is appropriate. The box was wooden, hand-carved with delicate wildflowers around the edges. Grandpa's work, I recognized immediately. I opened it carefully to find a key nestled on a bed of velvet. Not the familiar old key to the farmhouse that I already possessed, but something older, with an ornate design. That opens the roll-top desk in his study at the farmhouse, Mr. Thompson explained. He said you would know what to do with what you find there. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight, the weight of trust, of being seen and understood in a way my parents had never managed. My father stood abruptly. I think we've heard enough for today. Mr. Thompson, you'll be hearing from our attorney. The lawyer nodded calmly, gathering his papers. Of course, though I would strongly advise against pursuing litigation that would only bring the documented deception to public attention. He turned to me. Miss Miller, I'm available if you have any questions about the trust or your inheritance. As Mr. Thompson packed his briefcase, my mother approached, her voice low and urgent. Jennifer, you need to be reasonable about this. The family's financial security is not my responsibility, I finished for her, rising from my chair. A strange sense of calm had settled over me, replacing the shock. Grandpa made his wishes clear. I intend to honor them. The look she gave me was one I recognized from childhood. Disappointment mixed with the certainty that I would eventually yield to stronger wills than my own. But something had shifted inside me, as if my grandfather's words had unlocked a certainty I'd always lacked. I should go, I said, clutching the wooden box. I have matters to attend to at the farmhouse. I left without waiting for a response, stepping out into the sunlight with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Mr. Thompson followed shortly after, finding me beside my car. Your grandfather was very proud of you, you know, he said, his eyes kind. He saw in you the same quiet strength he admired in your grandmother. I swallowed against the sudden tightness in my throat. Thank you for doing this. It couldn't have been easy. He smiled slightly. Harold and I were friends for a long time. He helped me when my own family turned their backs on me years ago. Standing up for what's right rarely is easy, but it's always necessary. I nodded, unable to find words adequate to express the tumult of emotions. "The desk," he added softly. "Don't wait too long to open it." He was quite insistent about that. With that mysterious comment, he nodded farewell and walked to his car, leaving me standing in the driveway holding the key to whatever my grandfather had deemed important enough to lock away. The final message from a man who had seen me clearly when no one else had bothered to look. I drove directly to the farmhouse, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields as I pulled into the gravel drive. The old place seemed different somehow, no longer a repository of fading memories, but something alive with possibility. Standing on the porch, I took a deep breath of the familiar air, sweet with the scent of late summer grass and wild roses. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I didn't feel like an intruder here, a temporary caretaker of someone else's legacy. This was mine now, not just the property, but the responsibility to honor what it represented. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors as I made my way to Grandpa's study. The roll-top desk stood against the wall where it had always been, its surface neat and orderly just as he'd left it. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted the ornate key into the small lock at the center of the desk. It turned with a satisfying click, and the roll-top slid upward smoothly, revealing compartments and drawers I'd never seen open before. In the central cubby was a thick envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful hand. Inside, I found a letter, several legal documents, and a faded photograph of my grandmother standing on the porch, a young version of me balanced, on her hip, both of us laughing at something beyond the camera's view. I unfolded the letter slowly, settling into Grandpa's old chair as the last light of day illuminated the words he'd left for me alone. "My dearest Jenny," it began. "If you're reading this, then you've inherited not just a house, but a legacy of seeing value where others see only profit. The farmhouse has been more than a piece of property to our family. It has been a keeper of stories, a witness to lives lived fully and with purpose." I paused, running my fingers over his handwriting, imagining him at this very desk composing these words. "I've watched you grow from a curious child into a compassionate woman who understands that worth isn't measured in dollars. Your brother has his talents, but he's forgotten the lessons your grandmother and I tried to teach. That legacy isn't about money, but about values." My eyes stung, but I continued reading. "Enclosed, you'll find documents that will help you protect this place. First, the original deed from 1923 when my grandfather purchased this land. You'll note the conservation easement he established even then, restricting development of the North Woods and Creek. Second, I've included paperwork for the historical registry application I've been preparing. The farmhouse qualifies as a historic property, which will provide additional protection from development." I flipped through the documents, recognizing his methodical planning. Even from beyond, he was still guiding me, showing me the path forward. "Finally," the letter continued, "there's a detailed business plan for converting the old barn into a community space for art classes and workshops. Eleanor and I always dreamed of creating a place where people could learn traditional crafts, woodworking, quilting, preserving, the skills our society is forgetting. The trust I've established will fund the initial renovation, but the business model is sustainable if managed with care." I stared at the plans, detailed sketches showing the barn transformed into a bright, welcoming space with workbenches and display areas. So this was what he had been working on during those long afternoons I'd found him bent over his drafting table, refusing to share what he called his little project. "Jenny, I know this inheritance will bring challenges. Your parents and David will resist, perhaps even try to fight the will. But I've learned over my long life that some battles are worth fighting, especially when they protect something precious. You have more strength than you know, more resilience than you've been given credit for." I turned the page, blinking back tears that threatened to blur his words. "In the bottom drawer of this desk, you'll find a cedar box with your grandmother's journals. She kept them faithfully for 50 years, documenting not just our family's history, but her thoughts about what makes a meaningful life. Her wisdom guided me after she was gone. I hope it will do the same for you. I set the letter down and opened the drawer he'd mentioned. The cedar box was there, its lid inlaid with a delicate pattern of birds in flight, Grandpa's woodworking, at its finest. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals, arranged chronologically, their pages yellowed but the handwriting inside still clear and flowing. The final paragraph of his letter called me back. Remember, Jenny, this house has weathered storms, both literal and figurative, for a century. It endures because each generation has found meaning in its walls, value beyond its market price. Now it's your turn to be its steward. I have complete faith that you will honor its past while creating its future. All my love, Grandpa Harry. I sat in the gathering darkness, the letter in my lap, feeling an overwhelming mix of gratitude, determination, and responsibility. The room around me no longer felt empty of his presence. Instead, it seemed filled with purpose, his final gift to me. The shrill ring of my phone cut through the quiet, making me jump. David's name flashed on the screen. I considered ignoring it, but after a moment's hesitation, I answered. Jenny. His voice was tight, controlled. We need to talk. I'm listening, I said, keeping my own voice neutral. Not over the phone. I'm coming to the farmhouse. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Before I could respond, he'd hung up. I closed my eyes briefly, then began gathering the documents and the letter, returning them to their envelope. The cedar box of journals I carefully placed back in the drawer. There would be time for exploring those treasures later. I moved through the house, turning on lights, suddenly aware of how the darkness had crept in while I was absorbed in Grandpa's words. In the kitchen, I put on water for tea, a ritual that had always calmed me. The familiar motions, selecting. The battered tin of Earl Grey that had been Grandpa's favorite, warming the blue ceramic pot, measuring the loose leaves, steadied my nerves. When headlights swept across the front windows, cutting bright arcs through the evening darkness, I was ready. I heard the slam of a car door, then footsteps on the porch, heavier than necessary, deliberately announcing his presence. The knock, when it came, was sharp and insistent. I opened the door to find David standing there, still in his suit though he'd removed the tie. His hair, normally perfectly styled, was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. A nervous habit from childhood he'd mostly trained himself out of. "May I come in?" he asked stiffly, as if he were a stranger requesting entry rather than someone who'd spent countless summers racing through these very rooms. I stepped aside without comment. He walked past me into the front hall, his gaze sweeping over the worn rugs, the faded wallpaper, the family photographs lining the staircase wall. For a moment, I caught something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even nostalgia, before it hardened again into determined resolve. "Kitchen?" he asked, already moving in that direction, assuming correctly that's where I'd been waiting. I followed him, watching as he stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking out of place in his expensive suit amid the humble surroundings, the old oak table with its mismatched chairs, the vintage stove Grandpa had refused to replace. Despite my grandmother's periodic complaints, the row of mason jars on the windowsill filled with beach glass we'd collected on family vacations decades ago. The kettle whistled, giving me something to do besides stand there watching him struggle with whatever he'd come to say. I poured the water into the teapot, then set out 2 mugs, the chipped blue one that had always been mine, and the solid green one that, by unspoken agreement, had become David's during our teenage years. "Still Earl Grey?" I asked, knowing the answer, but feeling a need to break the tense silence. He nodded, then finally pulled out a chair and sat down, placing his phone face up on the table like a businessman prepared for interruptions. I set the pot between us to steep, then took the chair opposite him. I assume you've come to discuss the will, I said quietly. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Discuss? Is that what we're calling it? Grandpa just turned our entire family upside down, and you think we're going to have a calm discussion about it? I kept my voice even. What would you prefer? A shouting match? Threats? Because neither of those will change what happened today. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Jenny, be reasonable. You know you can't maintain this place. The property taxes alone are covered by the trust, I finished for him. For 10 years. Mr. Thompson explained that quite clearly. And after that, what's your plan? You'll drain your savings keeping up a property that's only going to deteriorate further. The smart move, the only move, is to sell now while the market is hot. I poured the tea, buying myself a moment to control the surge of irritation his words provoked. I have 10 years to figure that out, and Grandpa left me more than just the house. I didn't elaborate, not yet ready to share the business plan for the barn conversion. David took his mug but didn't drink, instead tapping his fingers against the ceramic in an agitated rhythm. Mom and Dad are devastated. You realize that, right? They had plans for the family's financial security. Their plans, I corrected, gently. Not Grandpa's. There's a difference. He was manipulated, David said flatly. He wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. I took a slow sip of tea before responding. Is that really what you think? Or is it just easier than admitting he saw exactly what was happening and made his own choices? David's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? The preliminary contracts with Greenwood developers. The subdivision plans. All while he was in the hospital. I kept my gaze steady on his face. Did you really think he wouldn't find out? A flush crept up his neck. That's out of context. I was exploring options, that's all. Looking ahead. Being prepared. For what? For him to die so you could cash in. He slammed his hand on the table, making the teapot rattle. Don't act so self-righteous. You weren't the one handling his finances, dealing with the medical bills, figuring out how to make everything work. You just showed up, made soup, and read him poetry. The glamorous role while I did all the actual work. The accusation stung more than I wanted to admit. Is that what you think I was doing? Playing the devoted granddaughter when it was convenient? I was here, David. 3 nights a week, minimum throughout his entire illness. I helped with his physical therapy, coordinated with his doctors, drove him to every appointment. While I kept his financial affairs in order, David countered, and apparently started selling off his property behind his back. We stared at each other across the table, the air between us thick with decades of unspoken resentments. Finally, David looked away, his shoulders sagging slightly. I didn't come here to fight, he said, his voice lower. Believe it or not, I'm trying to protect you. From what? From yourself. From making an emotional decision instead of a practical one. He ran a hand through his hair, confirmation that his composure was slipping. Jenny, be honest with yourself. You're clinging to this place because of memories, because it represents some idealized version of our childhood that wasn't even real. What wasn't real about it? I challenged. He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. All of this, the perfect grandparents, the idyllic farmhouse, the sweet family traditions. It was a fantasy, Jenny. A nice one, sure, but not reality. Reality is property values and tax assessments and maintenance costs. I studied my brother's face, wondering when exactly he'd transformed from the boy who'd helped me build tree forts in the Oak Grove to this man who saw the world solely in terms of financial calculations. When did you become so cynical? I asked softly. It's not cynicism, it's maturity, he shot back. I grew up. I stopped pretending that sentimentality pays the bills. And in the process, you lost sight of what actually matters. David's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it automatically. Whatever he saw there made his expression harden again. He stood abruptly. "This isn't getting us anywhere. I came to offer you a compromise, but clearly you're not in a reasonable frame of mind." "What kind of compromise?" I asked warily. "We can test the will together, split the proceeds from the sale of both properties evenly, and set up a family. Trust. You'd have more than enough to buy a nice place of your own, maybe even take some time off from nursing if you wanted." The proposal left me momentarily speechless. He was still planning to contest the will, still assuming he could simply override Grandpa's clearly stated wishes. And worse, he thought he could buy my cooperation. "David," I said carefully, "did you actually hear a word of what Grandpa wrote? In that letter? Did it register at all? This isn't about money for me." "Everything is about money eventually," he replied with absolute conviction. "You're just too naive to see it." I stood as well, suddenly weary of the conversation. "I think you should go. We both need time to process what happened today." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table. "This is contact information for Stephen Walsh. He's an excellent real estate attorney. When you're ready to discuss this rationally, call him. Or call me." He paused, then added, "Don't wait too long, Jenny. The developers won't hold their offer indefinitely." "I'm not selling," I said firmly. "Not now, not in 10 years. This property stays in the family." A look of genuine confusion crossed his face. "But why? What possible purpose does it serve gathering dust out here when it could be providing financial security for all of us?" In that moment, I realized the fundamental gap between us was unbridgeable. We weren't just disagreeing about the disposition of property. We were operating from entirely different value systems. Where I saw irreplaceable heritage, he saw untapped capital. Where I saw a living legacy, he saw an underperforming asset. "Goodbye, David," I said quietly. "Drive safely." He hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but something in my expression must have told him it would be futile. With a curt nod, he turned and walked out, his footsteps sharp on the wooden floors, then fading as the front door closed behind him. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. My tea had gone cold, but I sipped it anyway, needing the familiar ritual to ground me after the emotional turbulence of the past few hours. Outside, I heard David's car start, the gravel crunching under the tires as he backed out and drove away. The silence that settled over the house wasn't the lonely emptiness I'd felt in previous visits, but something more purposeful, a pause, a space for new beginnings. I rose slowly and moved to the window, looking out at the dark outline of the barn against the night sky. In my mind, I could already see it transformed according to Grandpa's vision, a place of creativity and community, of practical skills shared across generations. My phone chimed with a text notification. Expecting more from David, I was surprised to see Mr. Thompson's name instead. "Miss Miller, I hope you've had time to review the materials your grandfather left for you. If you're available tomorrow, I'd like to introduce you to someone who may be helpful with the next steps. Eleanor Fisher is an architect specializing in historic restoration. Harold spoke with her several times about the barn project. She'll be at my office at 10 a.m. if you'd care to join us." The message confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. Grandpa's planning had been far more extensive than the initial documents revealed. He hadn't just left me a property. He'd mapped out a path forward, connecting me with the resources I would need to realize his vision. I texted back a simple confirmation, then set my phone aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I needed to absorb what had already occurred. I gathered my mug and David's untouched tea and carried them to the sink, gazing out the window above it to the star-filled sky. A memory surfaced. Grandpa standing in this very spot years ago, looking out at the same view while teaching me. The constellations. "Some things change, Firefly," he'd said, using the nickname he'd given me as a child. "But the stars stay constant. When you're feeling lost, Look up. They'll remind you of what endures." I smiled at the recollection, feeling his presence not as a ghost, but as a continuing influence, a guiding hand still pointing the way. Upstairs, in what had always been my bedroom whenever I stayed over, I knew the faded quilt my grandmother had made still covered the narrow bed. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I decided to spend the night, not as a visitor trying to hold on to fleeting memories, but as the rightful caretaker of a place that now looked to me for protection. Morning came with soft light filtering through the east-facing windows, casting patterns across the worn wooden floor of the bedroom. For a moment upon waking, I experienced the momentary disorientation of sleeping in a familiar yet not quite home place. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back: the will reading, the letter, David's visit. I lay still, processing it all again in the clarity of daylight. A glance at my phone showed several missed calls from my mother and one text from David that simply read, "The offer stands. Think about it." I set the phone aside without responding. There would be time for those conversations later. I showered in the old clawfoot tub with its temperamental plumbing, another item on the mental list of renovations I was beginning to compile. Afterward, I dressed in clothes I'd left in the dresser years ago, jeans slightly loose now, and a faded flannel shirt that had once belonged to Grandpa. Looking in the mirror, I was struck by how right it felt, as if I were stepping not just into clothes, but into a role I'd been preparing for all along. Breakfast was simple: toast made from bread I'd brought yesterday and instant coffee from the supply I kept in the pantry for my visits. The routine felt different now, imbued with a sense of permanence that had been missing before. As I ate, I reviewed my mental list of what needed to be addressed immediately: meeting with Mr. Thompson and the architect, understanding the details of the trust, researching the historical registry process. The ring of the landline phone startled me. I'd almost forgotten the old house still had one. It rarely rang anymore, with most people calling my grandfather's cell phone or mine when they needed to reach us here. I crossed to the wall where the vintage beige phone hung and lifted the receiver hesitantly. "Hello? Jenny, it's Susan Parker from next door. I hope I'm not calling too early." The warm voice of my grandparents' longtime neighbor was instantly recognizable, though we hadn't spoken in months. "Not at all, Mrs. Parker. How are you?" "Oh, getting by, dear. These old bones complain more than they used to." She paused, then continued, her tone gentler. "I heard about yesterday. News travels fast in small circles." I sank into a chair, the long cord of the old phone stretching across the kitchen. "I'm not surprised. I assume David called his wife, who called someone else, and so on." "Actually, it was your father who phoned Roger Miller. You remember your dad's cousin? Who mentioned it to his wife June when she was at the grocery store where she ran into my daughter Beth, who called me straight away." Despite everything, I had to smile at the small-town communication network that functioned more efficiently than any social media platform. "Well, whatever the path, you heard correctly. Grandpa left me the farmhouse." "And not just the house," Mrs. Parker said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "The whole property. Harry talked to me about it, you know. Last spring when the dogwoods were blooming. He was so certain it was the right decision." This was news to me. "He discussed it with you?" "Oh, yes. We had our afternoon tea on my porch every Thursday, a tradition we kept up for 30 years. He said he wanted my opinion, though I suspect he'd already made up his mind." Her voice took on a fond, reminiscent quality. He said, "Susan, I've watched that girl love this place her whole life. David sees dollar signs, but Jenny sees home. That's who should have it." Tears pricked at my eyes, both from the sentiment and the realization that Grandpa had sought counsel, had carefully considered his decision rather than making it in isolation as my parents had implied. "Mrs. Parker, that means a lot to hear." "Well, there's more to it. Harry asked me to keep an eye out, to be a resource for you if you needed one. I've lived next door for 40 years. I know every quirk of these old houses, every seasonal challenge, and I have a son who's a contractor specializing in historic homes. I told Harry I'd make sure you had Mark's number when the time came. The offer of practical help was unexpectedly moving. Thank you. I might need to take you up on that sooner rather than later. Grandpa left plans for converting the barn into some kind of community craft center. I'm meeting with an architect this morning about it. The Arts Center! Yes, he was so excited about that idea. Eleanor had been talking about something similar for years before she passed. Harry felt it would be the perfect tribute to her. We talked for a few more minutes, with Mrs. Parker offering insights into which local tradespeople were reliable and which to avoid, promising to email me her son's contact information and extending an open invitation for afternoon tea. Anytime, dear, just like your grandfather. By the time I hung up, I felt fortified by the connection, by the reminder that I wasn't alone in this endeavor. Grandpa had done more than leave me property. He'd cultivated a network of support that was now quietly making itself known. I glanced at the clock, 8:30. Just enough time to visit the barn before heading to town for my meeting with Mr. Thompson and the architect. I pulled on a light jacket against the morning chill and stepped outside. The day was glorious, the kind of perfect early autumn morning that seemed designed to showcase the farmhouse property at its best. Dew sparkled on the grass, catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. The old oak trees that lined the drive were just beginning to show hints of gold among their green leaves. In the distance, I could see a pair of deer grazing at the edge of the North Woods, the protected area mentioned in the conservation easement Grandpa had shown me. I followed the worn path that led from the back porch to the barn, a route I'd traveled countless times throughout my life. The massive structure loomed ahead, its weathered red paint faded to a soft rust color that somehow worked perfectly against the backdrop of fields and sky. It had been a working barn when my great-grandfather farmed the land, but in recent decades had served primarily as storage, a huge, underutilized space filled with old farm equipment, discarded furniture, and the accumulated odds and ends of 4 generations. The heavy double doors groaned as I pulled them open, releasing a familiar scent of hay, dust, and aged wood. Sunlight streamed through the high windows and cracks between the siding, creating dramatic shafts of light in the cavernous interior. I stood just inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness, taking in the soaring ceiling with its exposed beams, the solid plank floor worn smooth by years of use. Grandpa's vision suddenly seemed not just possible, but inevitable. I could see it clearly. The central space opened up for demonstrations and classes, workbenches lining the walls, the hayloft converted into a gallery for displaying finished pieces. The structure itself was sound, the bones good. With proper renovation, it could become exactly what he and Grandma had dreamed of, a place where traditional crafts could be preserved and passed down. As I explored, mentally noting which areas would need the most work, I discovered something I hadn't noticed in previous visits: a newer section of wall at the far end of the barn, built with boards that didn't quite match the weathered patina of the rest. Curious, I moved closer and found a door, unmarked and easily overlooked if you weren't paying attention. It opened with surprising ease, revealing a space about the size of a small bedroom, finished with proper insulation and drywall, stark contrast to the rustic barn surrounding it. Inside was a woodworker's paradise. A large workbench, carefully organized tools hanging on pegboards, shelves of wood in various stages of projects. Grandpa's private workshop, hidden away where he could work undisturbed. A half-finished music box sat on the bench, its delicate gears and wooden casing evidence of his meticulous craftsmanship. Beside it lay a sketch and notes in his distinctive handwriting. For Jenny, 30th birthday. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers over the smooth cherry wood, recognizing the pattern he'd been carving. Violets, my favorite flower since childhood. He'd been making this for me when he fell ill, a gift never completed. The realization brought fresh grief, but also a deep sense of connection. In this quiet space, surrounded by the tools of his beloved craft, I felt closest to him. A wall clock informed me it was nearly 9:15, time to head to town if I wanted to be punctual for my meeting. Reluctantly, I left the workshop, carefully closing the door behind me. The discovery felt like a private message from Grandpa, another piece of the legacy he'd entrusted to me. As I drove toward town, I realized I was approaching a crossroads, both literally where the country road met the highway and figuratively in my life. Ahead lay challenges: family conflict, renovation decisions, financial considerations, but also possibility. For the first time in years, I felt a clear sense of purpose, a vision for the future that aligned perfectly with who I was and what I valued. David's text message came to mind. The offer stands. Think about it. I already had, and my answer remained the same. The farmhouse wasn't just property to me. It was a responsibility, a privilege, and now a purpose. Whatever came next, I knew with absolute certainty that Grandpa had been right. This was where I belonged. Mr. Thompson's office occupied the second floor of a well-preserved Victorian on Springfield's historic Main Street. I arrived a few minutes early, taking a moment to compose myself before heading inside. The meeting with the architect represented a tangible step toward fulfilling Grandpa's vision, a commitment to the future of the farmhouse beyond simply preserving it. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, smiled in recognition as I entered. "Jenny Miller," she said warmly. "I haven't seen you since you were in high school, helping your grandfather organize his files. How you've grown!" I returned her smile, trying to place her. "Mrs. Winters? I didn't realize you still worked with Mr. Thompson." 42 years and counting," she confirmed with obvious pride. "Your grandfather used to say Jim and I were fixtures, not employees. He always brought me wildflower honey from your family's property." Her expression softened. "I was so sorry to hear of his passing. Harold was one of the good ones." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by this unexpected connection. "He thought very highly of you, too." She gestured toward a hallway. "They're waiting for you in the conference room. First door on your left." The conference room was sun-filled and comfortable, with a round oak table rather than the imposing rectangular boardroom style I'd been expecting. Mr. Thompson stood as I entered, extending a hand in greeting. Beside him was a woman perhaps a decade older than me, with short auburn hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish tortoiseshell glasses. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming," Mr. Thompson said. "May I introduce Eleanor Fisher? Eleanor, this is Jennifer Miller, Harold's granddaughter." The woman rose, her handshake firm and confident. "Please, call me Ellie. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under happier circumstances. Your grandfather spoke of you often." "You knew him well?" I asked, taking the offered seat. "We worked together on several projects over the past few years," she explained. "Historic preservation is my specialty, and Harold was passionate about maintaining the architectural integrity of the farmhouse while adapting the barn for modern use." Mr. Thompson opened a folder. "Before we dive into the architectural aspects, I want to make sure you're clear on the financial structure your grandfather established. The trust is designed to cover property taxes and basic maintenance for 10 years, as I mentioned yesterday. Additionally, there's a separate renovation fund specifically earmarked for the barn conversion project, approximately $230,000. I blinked in surprise. "That's, substantial." "Harold was meticulous about his finances," Mr. Thompson said, with a slight smile. "He lived modestly, invested wisely, and saved specifically for this purpose. The fund is structured to be released in phases as the project progresses, with Ms. Fisher serving as project manager if you're amenable." Ellie leaned forward. Your grandfather and I developed preliminary plans over the past year. I have the latest iterations here. She spread blueprints across the table. The concept is to preserve the historic exterior while creating a functional interior space that honors traditional crafts. I studied the drawings, impressed by how faithfully they captured what I'd envisioned when reading Grandpa's letter. The main floor was divided into open workshop areas, classroom spaces, and a small gallery. The old hayloft had been reimagined as additional display space with a reading nook filled with resource materials on traditional crafts. Most surprising was the addition of a small apartment at the rear of the structure, a caretaker's residence that hadn't been mentioned in Grandpa's letter. The living quarters were a late addition, Ellie explained, noting my interest. Harold thought it might serve multiple purposes: accommodation for visiting artisans teaching weekend workshops, rental income to help sustain the center, or simply a quiet retreat for you. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. There is one time-sensitive matter we should address. The historical registry application needs to be submitted within 30 days to take advantage of certain tax benefits and preservation grants. Harold had completed most of the paperwork, but there are a few remaining details requiring your attention. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of information: timelines, permits, contractors, grant opportunities. Ellie's expertise was evident in the way she anticipated questions before I could ask them, presenting options without overwhelming me with decisions. By the time we concluded 2 hours later, I had a clear roadmap for the next 6 months. One last thing, Mr. Thompson said as we were gathering our materials. Harold asked me to give you this once the initial meeting was complete. He handed me another envelope, this one thin and lightweight. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a letter this time, but a list of names and phone numbers with a brief note at the top. The village it takes. These people helped shape who I am. They'll help you too if you let them. I recognized some of the names, Mrs. Parker, of course, and several other neighbors and longtime family friends. Others were unfamiliar, annotated with descriptions like master woodworker or heritage seed specialist, or knows more about local history than the Historical Society. He was building your support network, Ellie observed with a gentle smile. Harold understood that preserving the past is never a solo endeavor. As I drove back to the farmhouse, my mind was racing with possibilities. What had begun as a shock, inheriting a property I'd assumed would go to David, was rapidly evolving into something purposeful. The center could become exactly what Grandpa and Grandma had envisioned, a place where traditional skills were valued and preserved, where artisans could gather and share their knowledge, where the community could reconnect with crafts that were slowly disappearing in our digital age. The farmhouse came into view as I crested the final hill, its white clapboard gleaming in the midday sun. For a moment, I allowed myself to truly see it as mine, not just a repository of memories, but the foundation for something new, yet deeply rooted in what had come before. My moment of reflection was interrupted by the sight of an unfamiliar car parked in the drive, a sleek black sedan that screamed corporate in its anonymous luxury. My stomach tightened as I pulled in beside it. Before I could even exit my car, the front door of the farmhouse opened, and my parents stepped onto the porch. They'd used their key, of course they had. The farmhouse had been family property, and they'd never considered that their access might now be restricted. My father stood stiffly at the top of the porch steps, arms crossed, while my mother hovered uncertainly beside him, her expression a mix of determination and discomfort. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was on solid legal ground. The property was mine, by Grandpa's clear and documented wishes. Still, confronting my parents, especially my father, stirred old insecurities. I'd spent a lifetime being the disappointing child, the one who didn't follow the expected path, who chose service over status and meaning over money. Jennifer, my father said as I approached, his tone formal as always. We need to talk. You might have called first. I replied evenly, climbing the steps to join them. This is my home now. A flash of irritation crossed his face at the gentle reminder of ownership. A situation that needs addressing. May we go inside? I hesitated, then nodded, leading them into the living room rather than the more intimate kitchen where David and I had had our confrontation. They sat together on the sofa while I took Grandpa's armchair, a position that felt both symbolic and comforting. I assume David told you about our conversation last night, I began, deciding to take control of the discussion from the outset. He mentioned you were being unreasonable, my father responded, his jaw tight. Jennifer, I understand you have an emotional attachment to this place, but you need to think practically. My mother leaned forward, her voice softer. Darling, we're worried about you. This property is a tremendous responsibility, financial and otherwise. Your father and I think it would be best for everyone if we pursued a family solution. You mean selling to developers and splitting the proceeds? I translated. It would provide security for all of us, my father said. Your brother has children to consider, your niece and nephew's education, their future. And frankly, Jennifer, your nursing career isn't exactly lucrative. This could be your opportunity to establish some financial stability. The familiar dismissal of my chosen profession stung, but less sharply than it once had. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in selling. Grandpa left the farmhouse to me because he knew I would protect it, not liquidate it. My mother sighed. Harold wasn't thinking clearly. He became fixated on preserving this place after Eleanor died. It wasn't rational. It wasn't your kind of rational, I corrected gently. But it made perfect sense to him and to me. This property represents something worth protecting. History, heritage, a connection to the land that money can't replace. My father's expression hardened. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes, Jennifer. The trust does, I replied. For 10 years, giving me plenty of time to implement Grandpa's vision for the barn renovation and establish a sustainable model for the property. They exchanged glances, clearly surprised by my knowledge of the financial details. What barn renovation? My father asked, suspicion evident in his tone. I explained the art center concept briefly, watching their reactions shift from skepticism to something closer to confusion as they realized the extent of Grandpa's planning. You can't possibly manage a project of that scale, my father said, dismissively. You have no experience in property development or business management. I have Grandpa's business plan, a qualified architect who's already drafted blueprints, and a network of supporters with relevant expertise, I countered. And I have something else, the legal right to make these decisions without your approval. My mother flinched slightly at my directness. Jennifer, please, we're trying to help you. This idea of an art center is, well, it's a lovely dream, but dreams don't pay bills. Actually, according to the business model, this one will, I said, rising to retrieve the folder of documents from Grandpa's desk. I spread the financial projections on the coffee table between us. Workshop fees, artist residencies, gallery commissions, grant funding. It's all accounted for. Grandpa didn't just leave me a property. He left me a viable path forward. My father barely glanced at the paperwork. Harold was an old man with romantic notions about preserving the past. The real value of this land lies in its development potential. You're being selfish, Jennifer, putting your sentimental attachment above the family's financial interests. That's not fair, I said quietly. I'm honoring Grandpa's wishes and protecting something valuable. That's not selfish. It's principled. Principles don't secure your future, he shot back. They secured Grandpa's, I replied. He lived by his values, and he died knowing exactly what mattered most to him. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air between us, unanswered. My father stood abruptly, straightening his jacket. With a sharp tug, I can see this conversation is pointless. You've made up your mind. Just as you made up yours, before even hearing me out. I gathered the documents, carefully returning them to their folder. Grandpa wasn't confused or manipulated. He made a deliberate choice based on shared values and trust. My mother rose more slowly, her expression conflicted. Jennifer, please. Just promise you'll think about this carefully. Once you've had time to process everything, you might see things differently. I walked them to the door, maintaining a calm I didn't entirely feel. I'll always listen, Mom. But I'm not going to change my mind about selling the property. This place deserves to be preserved, not demolished for profit. My father paused on the porch, turning to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Frustration. Certainly, but perhaps something else too. You're more like him than I realized, he said finally. I wasn't sure if he meant it as criticism or observation, but I chose to take it as the highest compliment. Thank you, I said simply. After they left, I returned to the living room and sank into Grandpa's chair, emotionally drained but oddly fortified. Standing up to my parents, particularly my father, had always been difficult. Their disappointment had been a weight I carried. For years, their approval an elusive goal I'd eventually stopped pursuing. But today, something had shifted. I'd spoken my truth without apology, defended my decisions without wavering. The confrontation with my parents marked a turning point. Though I didn't fully recognize it at the time, over the next several weeks, a pattern emerged. David made periodic offers to resolve the situation amicably, each with slightly better terms but always involving the sale of the property. My parents alternated between emotional appeals and thinly veiled threats of legal action, and I grew increasingly confident in my vision for the farmhouse's future. The barn renovation project became my focus. I reduced my nursing hours to part-time, allowing me to dedicate 3 days a week to the property. Ellie proved to be not just a talented architect, but a patient teacher, guiding me through the complexities of historic preservation requirements, building codes, and grant applications. The list of contacts Grandpa had provided became invaluable. Tom Jensen, the master woodworker notation, turned out to be a retired shop teacher who'd been Grandpa's close friend for decades. He volunteered to help assess the barn's structural elements and offered to teach woodworking classes once the center opened. Sarah Winters, the heritage seed specialist, enthusiastically agreed to design and oversee a teaching garden beside the barn where traditional plant varieties could be grown and preserved. Mrs. Parker became a daily fixture, bringing coffee and homemade muffins during morning planning sessions, sharing stories about the property's history that even I hadn't known. Her son, Mark, the contractor, provided invaluable advice on which aspects of the renovation we could handle ourselves and which required professional intervention. As October turned to November, the community around the farmhouse began to take shape, not just as supporters of the project, but as stakeholders in its success. People stopped by to offer help, share skills, or simply express gratitude that the property wouldn't become another cookie-cutter development. The first snow fell early that year, dusting the farm in white one late November morning. I stood on the porch wrapped in one of Grandma's old quilts, watching the flakes swirl and settle on the newly repaired barn roof. 6 weeks of dedicated work had already transformed the structure's exterior. Rotted boards replaced, fresh paint applied, windows restored to their original condition. The sound of tires on gravel drew my attention to the drive, where a now familiar black SUV was making its way toward the house. David's visits had become less confrontational over time, evolving into a strained but civil negotiation. Today, however, something seemed different. He wasn't alone. I watched as he parked and helped his daughter Emma out of the back seat. At 8, she was the spitting image of my brother. Same determined chin, same serious eyes, though her personality was entirely her own. Behind them, David's wife Caroline emerged with 5-year-old Liam in tow, the boy bouncing with the restless energy that characterized his every movement. This was unexpected. David had kept his family entirely separate from our inheritance, never bringing them to the farmhouse during our discussions. I set my coffee down and moved to greet them, curious about this sudden change in approach. "Uncle David said you live in a castle now," Liam announced as they reached the porch, his eyes wide as he took in the 2-story farmhouse with its wraparound porch and dormer windows. I smiled, crouching to his level. "Not quite a castle, buddy. Just an old farmhouse that belonged to your great-grandpa." Emma studied me with solemn eyes. "Dad says you're turning the barn into an art place. Is that true?" "It will be a place where people can learn all kinds of traditional crafts," I explained. "Woodworking, quilting, gardening, the kinds of skills great-grandpa and great-grandma thought were important." Caroline stepped forward, offering a hesitant smile. "I hope we're not intruding, Jenny. The kids have been asking about the farmhouse, and David thought, well, we thought it might be good for them to see it." I glanced at my brother, trying to read his expression. We hadn't spoken since our last tense conversation 2 weeks ago, when he'd presented yet another compromise proposal. "You're all welcome here," I said, meaning it despite my confusion. "Would you like to come in? I can make hot chocolate." The offer sealed the deal for the children, who immediately began removing boots and coats in the entryway. Caroline followed them, inside, leaving David and me momentarily alone on the porch. "This is a surprise," I said quietly. He shuffled slightly, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Emma's been asking about Grandpa Harry's house. She remembers coming here for 4th of July picnics, and with all the talk about the property. I thought it might be good for them to see it, to understand." "Understand what?" He looked away, his gaze fixing on the distant barn. "What you're trying to preserve. Why it matters to you." This was unexpected, a crack in the united front he'd maintained with our parents. "Thank you for that," I said carefully. "I'd like them to know this place. It's part of their heritage, too." Inside, the children's excitement transformed the quiet house. Liam raced from room to room, discovering treasures in every corner: the grandfather clock with its mesmerizing pendulum, the window seat where I'd spent countless rainy afternoons reading, the collection of carved wooden animals Grandpa had made over the years. Emma was more reserved but equally curious, examining family photographs and asking thoughtful questions about the people and stories they represented. Caroline helped me prepare hot chocolate and cinnamon toast in the kitchen, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine warmth. "It's lovely what you're doing with the place, Jenny. David mentioned some of your plans for the art center. It sounds wonderful." "I think it will be," I said, surprised by her interest. "Grandpa and Grandma always wanted this property to serve a purpose beyond just housing the family. The center feels like the right way to honor that vision." She glanced toward the living room, where David was showing the children how to wind the grandfather clock, a ritual he'd performed with Grandpa countless times as a boy. "He's struggling with all this," she said softly. "Not just the inheritance, but reconciling the father who raised him with the grandfather who made these choices." I hadn't considered that perspective, how my father's values had shaped David's, how the disruption of expected inheritance patterns might be forcing my brother to question more than just financial arrangements. "I don't want to fight with him," I admitted. "I just can't give up what Grandpa entrusted to me." "I know," Caroline said, squeezing my hand gently. "And I think deep down, so does David. He just needs time." After hot chocolate, I gave the IE children a tour of the property, bundling them into coats and boots for a trek to the barn. David and Caroline followed at a distance, giving us space but remaining within sight. The newly fallen snow crunched beneath our feet as we crossed the yard, Liam racing ahead while Emma walked beside me, asking questions about the renovation plans. "Will you have art classes for kids?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds. in the cold air. Absolutely, I assured her. Weekend workshops, summer programs, all kinds of opportunities for children to learn these skills. Her face brightened. I like to draw, and Dad showed me how to use a hammer last summer when we built a birdhouse. Your great-grandpa would have loved that, I said, smiling at the connection across generations. He believed everyone should know how to make things with their hands. Inside the barn, Liam was suitably impressed by the vastness of the space, racing from wall to wall with unbridled enthusiasm. Emma was more thoughtful, studying the architectural plans I'd pinned to a makeshift bulletin board. "This looks like something from a movie," she declared. "Like a place where magic happens." Her words caught me off guard with their unexpected insight. "That's exactly what it's meant to be," I agreed. "A place where ordinary skills become something special." Later, as the family prepared to leave, David lingered behind while Caroline helped the children into the car. We stood on the porch in the fading afternoon light, an awkward silence between us. "Thank you for today," I said finally. "It was good to see the kids. They're welcome here anytime." He nodded, hands thrust deep in his coat pockets. They enjoyed it. Emma hasn't stopped talking about the art barn since I first mentioned it. He hesitated, then added, "I showed the business plan to Caroline. She thinks it could work." This admission surprised me. "Really?" "She's always had better instincts about these things than I have," he said with a small, rueful smile. "She pointed out that I've been so focused on what the property is worth in dollars that I missed what it's worth in other ways." I didn't know how to respond to this unexpected shift, this glimpse of reflection from my usually unyielding brother. "I'm not saying I agree with how Grandpa handled things," he continued, "but I've been thinking about what he wrote in that letter, about creating versus accumulating." He glanced toward the car where his children waited. "I want them to have security, but I also want them to understand value beyond money. Maybe there's room for both." It wasn't a full endorsement of my plans or a complete reconciliation, but it was something. A crack in the wall that had divided us, a possible path toward understanding. "I think Grandpa would say there has to be," I offered. As their car disappeared down the drive, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The day's visit hadn't resolved the larger family conflict, but it had revealed possibilities I hadn't considered, that bridges could be built, that understanding could grow, that perhaps the farmhouse could still bring the family together, though in ways none of us had anticipated. 3 months after the reading of Grandpa's will, I stood in the converted barn, watching as the final touches were applied to the main workshop space. The renovation had progressed more quickly than anyone anticipated, thanks to the growing, community of supporters who'd contributed time, materials, and expertise to the project. The afternoon sun streamed through the restored windows, highlighting the beauty of the exposed beams and polished wood floors. Workbenches lined the walls, each a tribute to a different traditional craft: woodworking, quilting, pottery, blacksmithing, food preservation. In the center of the room, a massive harvest table built from reclaimed barnwood provided space for demonstrations and communal projects. Ellie joined me, clipboard in hand, as she checked items off her final inspection list. "We're ahead of schedule and under budget," she announced with satisfaction. "Your grandfather would be proud." "It feels like he's been guiding us every step of the way," I admitted, running my hand along the smooth edge of the table. So many moments when we'd face a challenge, and then the perfect solution would appear, often from someone on his contact list. "The village it takes," she quoted with a smile. Mrs. Parker entered through the main doors, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I thought the workers might appreciate some lunch," she explained, setting it on the table. "My famous apple turnovers, Harold's favorite." The mention of Grandpa brought a fresh wave of both grief and gratitude. "I wish he could see this," I said softly. "Oh, I think he does, dear," Mrs. Parker replied with quiet conviction. "And I know he's pleased." As we prepared for the center's official opening, scheduled for the spring equinox, word spread throughout the community. Local artisans contacted me about teaching workshops, nearby schools inquired about field trip opportunities, and a regional arts council offered grant support for programming. Most surprising was the call that came from my father 3 weeks before the opening. "Your mother and I would like to contribute something," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Harold's woodworking tools. They should be at the center, used, for teaching rather than sitting in storage at David's." The offer represented more than just tools. It was an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that the path I'd chosen deserved respect. "Grandpa would like that," I said, emotion tightening my throat. "Will you come to the opening?" A pause, then, "We'll be there." The morning of the opening dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the outdoor celebration we'd planned. I'd been up since dawn, making final preparations and greeting early arrivals. Volunteers setting up displays, food vendors arranging their stations, musicians testing sound equipment on the small stage erected near the garden. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the property come alive with activity, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was exactly what the place was meant to be. Not just preserved as a static monument to the past, but vibrant, evolving, a bridge between generations and traditions. David arrived with his family mid-morning, Emma clutching a folder of drawings she'd created for the occasion, and Liam bouncing with excitement. Caroline embraced me warmly, then stepped back to survey the scene. "Jenny, it's magnificent, even better than the plan suggested." My brother's hug was more reserved but genuine. "Impressive," he admitted, looking toward the barn where visitors were already gathering. "You've accomplished a lot in a short time." "Not alone," I reminded him. "It really did take a village." My parents appeared shortly after, moving somewhat stiffly through the crowd, but making an effort to engage with the displays and demonstrations. My father lingered at the woodworking station where Grandpa's tools were arranged, explaining their use to an attentive group of teenagers. My mother, to my surprise, signed up for a summer quilting workshop, admitting she'd always wanted to learn. As the official ribbon cutting approached, I found myself surrounded by family, not just my parents and David's family, but the extended community that had embraced the project. Mrs. Parker stood proudly at my side. Ellie beamed from the front row. Tom Jensen adjusted his camera to capture the moment. My prepared speech felt suddenly inadequate for the occasion. Setting it aside, I spoke from the heart instead. My grandfather believed that some things are worth preserving, not just objects or buildings, but skills, stories, connections to the land and to each other. This center exists because he had the courage to protect what he valued, and because so many of you shared that vision. I glanced around at the faces before me, family by blood and family by choice, united in this moment of creation. The Miller Family Arts and Heritage Center welcomes everyone who wants to learn, to teach, to remember, or to create something new. In honoring our past, we build our future. As I cut the ribbon and the crowd erupted in applause, I felt Grandpa's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost or memory, but as a continuing influence, a set of values that would guide generations to come. David approached as the formal ceremony concluded, Emma at his side. "That was well said," he acknowledged, "and well done." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about those woodworking tools. I might like to learn how to use them properly. Maybe sign up for a beginner's class." The offer of reconciliation, wrapped in this simple request, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I think that could be arranged," I managed. "Grandpa would like that." Emma tugged at my hand. "Aunt Jenny, can I show you my drawings for the art barn?" "I'd love to see them," I said, crouching to her level. "And it's your art barn too, you know. This place belongs to all of us now." As I walked with my niece toward the center, I realized the truth of those words. The inheritance hadn't divided our family as I'd feared. Instead, it had created something new, a shared purpose, a common ground where different values could coexist and perhaps even complement each other. Grandpa's final gift hadn't been just the property or the business plan or even the trust fund to make it possible. It had been the vision to see beyond immediate value to lasting worth and the courage to protect that worth against easier, more profitable paths. In the years that followed, the center flourished beyond our expectations. Workshops filled to capacity, the garden produced heritage vegetables for local restaurants, and the small apartment became a sought-after residency for visiting artisans. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was how the farmhouse reclaimed its role as a gathering place for the family. Sunday dinners on the porch, holiday celebrations by the fireplace, impromptu visits that gradually healed old wounds. David never fully embraced the simpler lifestyle the farmhouse represented, but he developed a genuine appreciation for its value. His children grew up with mud on their boots and sawdust in their hair, equally at home in their suburban neighborhood, and the rural farmstead that connected them to their roots. My parents, to everyone's surprise, became regular visitors. My father eventually teaching a popular workshop on restoring antique furniture. My mother hosting quilting circles that produced works of art as well as functional beauty. As for me, I found a balance I hadn't thought possible, continuing my nursing career while overseeing the center, finding in both a sense of purpose and belonging. The caretaker's apartment became my home, allowing me to be present for both. Planned events and quiet moments when the property's beauty spoke most eloquently. 5 years after the opening, on a perfect autumn day, much like the one when Grandpa's will had been read, I sat on the porch swing watching golden leaves drift across the lawn. An open journal rested in my lap, one of Grandma's that I'd been slowly reading, finding in her words a wisdom that transcended time. The true value of anything, she'd written decades earlier, is measured by what it gives, not what it takes. Our home gives shelter, yes, but also memories, connections, roots that anchor our family through storms. Harold and I choose to be stewards rather than owners, passing on not just property, but purpose. In the distance, I could see David's car approaching, bringing my brother and his family for our weekly dinner. The barn bustled with activity, a weekend workshop in full swing, laughter and conversation floating across the yard. Inside the farmhouse, a pot of Grandma's vegetable soup simmered on the stove, made from her recipe and garden-grown ingredients. This, I realized, was the inheritance that mattered most. Not the deed or the buildings or even the land itself, but the living legacy of values, the continuity of care passing from one generation to the next. Grandpa had trusted me to understand that, to protect not just a place, but a way of seeing the world. As my family gathered on the porch, I closed the journal with a sense of profound gratitude. Some inheritances can't be measured in dollars or acres. Some are built of sturdier stuff, of principles, memories, and the courage to stand firm when the world tries to tell you that value and price are the same thing. In the end, Grandpa's real will had never been about who got what. It had been about who understood why. The concept drawings Ellie spread across the table took my breath away. She had captured the essence of what the barn could become, a perfect blend of preservation and innovation. The main space maintained its soaring, cathedral ceiling and exposed beams, but with modern lighting that highlighted the original architecture. Workshop areas were thoughtfully arranged to maximize natural light from the existing windows, while new interior walls created dedicated spaces for different crafts without disrupting the barn's open feel. Your grandfather was adamant about keeping the soul of the building intact, Ellie explained, pointing to specific features. He wanted visitors to feel the history even as they created something new. These walls are designed to be movable for larger gatherings, and we've planned the electrical and plumbing to support multiple configurations. I leaned closer, studying the detailed renderings. It's exactly what I imagined when reading his letter, only better. More complete. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat gently. There is one aspect we haven't discussed yet, the business structure. He opened another folder. Harold established a non-profit foundation, the Miller Heritage Arts Foundation, to oversee the center's operations. The paperwork is complete, but he left the board composition for you to determine. This was new information, and it made perfect sense. A nonprofit structure would allow access to grants and tax benefits while ensuring the center's mission remained focused on education rather than profit. Who did Grandpa suggest for the board? I asked. He named you as executive director and specified that the board should include individuals who understand the value of traditional crafts and community education. Beyond that, he left the selection to your discretion. As we continued discussing timelines and next steps, I felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just a property I'd inherited. It was a mission, carefully planned and prepared for, by my grandfather. He'd spent years laying the groundwork, establishing the financial structure, developing architectural plans, creating the legal framework, all while keeping his intentions private from those who might have interfered. By the time our meeting concluded, we had a clear roadmap. Submit the historical registry application immediately, begin the permit process for the barn renovation within 2 weeks, establish the foundation board within 30 days, and aim for a soft opening of the center by late spring. One last thing, Ellie said as we gathered our materials. Harold mentioned you have nursing experience. He thought that might translate well to teaching traditional healing arts, herbal remedies, medicinal gardens, that sort of thing. It was something he and your grandmother were particularly interested in preserving. The suggestion caught me off guard, but immediately resonated. Grandma had indeed been known for her knowledge of home remedies, keeping a small herb garden, specifically for medicinal purposes. It was a connection between my professional life and family heritage I hadn't considered. I'd like that, I said softly. It would honor both of them. As I drove back to the farmhouse, my mind buzzed with possibilities. The center could become a bridge between past and present, teaching skills that were increasingly rare yet fundamentally valuable. In an age of mass production and digital detachment, it would offer something different: connection, craftsmanship, the satisfaction of creating with one's own hands. The farmhouse came into view as I rounded the final curve in the road, its white clapboard gleaming in the afternoon sun. For the first time, I truly saw it as Grandpa had. Not as a piece of real estate with development potential, but as a living heritage, a vessel for values and knowledge worth preserving. My reflection was interrupted by the sight of a truck. In the driveway, not my parents' sleek sedan or David's SUV, but an older model pickup with the logo of a local construction company on the door. A middle-aged man in work clothes stood on the porch, notebook in hand, studying the roofline with a professional eye. I parked beside him, curious and slightly wary. "Can I help you?" He turned, offering a weathered hand. "Mark Parker, ma'am. My mother, Susan, asked me to stop by and take a look at your roof before winter sets in. Said your grandfather would want it checked. Mrs. Parker's son, the contractor she'd mentioned on the phone. That's very kind of you. I wasn't expecting anyone today." He gestured toward the northwest corner of the house. "Got some shingles lifting there, and the flashing around the chimney could use attention. Nothing major, but best addressed before snowflies." He flipped open his notebook. "I took some measurements and can give you an estimate for repairs, unless you've already got someone lined up?" "No, I don't. I'm still figuring out, well, everything." I smiled, appreciating this practical offer of help from a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all. "Your mother mentioned you specialize in historic homes?" He nodded, pride evident in his expression. 23 years restoring properties throughout the county. Worked on this place with your grandfather back in '08 when that big storm took down part of the porch roof. He was particular about maintaining original features. Taught me a lot about traditional building methods. This was exactly the kind of connection Grandpa had tried to provide through his list of contacts. People who shared his values and could help me navigate the practical challenges of preserving the property. I'd appreciate your help with the roof, and actually we're planning a major renovation of the barn, converting it into a community arts center. I'd value your input on that as well. Mark's eyes lit up. The arts center? Mom mentioned Harry had been planning something like that for years. I'd be honored to be involved. He hesitated, then added, "No pressure, but I've got some historical barn renovation photos back at the office from similar projects. Could drop them by if you're interested." I'd like that very much. After Mark left, promising to return the following day with a proper estimate and the reference photos, I sat on the porch swing, processing the day's developments. In just 24 hours, the inheritance that had initially seemed overwhelming was taking shape as something manageable, even exciting. Grandpa hadn't just left me property, he'd left a supportive community, a viable plan, and the financial resources to implement it. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Need to talk. Lawyer found something concerning in trust documents. Dinner tonight? Caroline can watch the kids." The message immediately triggered my defenses. Was this another attempt to challenge the will? To find a legal loophole that would force me to sell? I briefly considered declining, then took a deep breath. Whatever David had discovered, facing it directly was better than wondering. I texted back, "Fairgrounds Cafe at 7?" He responded immediately, "See you then." The Fairgrounds Cafe occupied a converted train depot on the edge of town, neutral territory for both of us. Neither the upscale restaurants David preferred, nor the casual diners I typically chose. I arrived early, selecting a booth at the A, back where our conversation would have some privacy. David entered precisely at 7, his appearance more casual than I'd expected, khakis and a sweater rather than his usual suit. He spotted me and made his way through the evening crowd, sliding into the booth with a nod that wasn't quite friendly but lacked the hostility of our last encounter. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, accepting the menu the server offered. I thought this would be better discussed in person. We ordered coffee, his black, mine with cream, and fell into an awkward silence until the server departed. I decided to cut to the chase. "What did your lawyer find that concerns you?" David reached into his messenger bag and withdrew a folder, placing it on the table between us. "It's not what you think," he said, apparently reading my expression. "I'm not contesting the will. That was unexpected." "You're not?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of our father when he was uncomfortable. "No. After our last conversation, I had my lawyer review everything more thoroughly. The documentation Grandpa compiled about my activities regarding the property makes any challenge futile. He had every legal right to distribute his assets as he saw fit, and he clearly wasn't confused or manipulated. The admission was delivered clinically, but it represented a significant shift from his previous position. So, what is concerning about the trust documents?" He opened the folder, revealing legal papers with highlighted sections. "It's about the broader family property history. My lawyer did a title search as part of his research, going back to the original purchase in 1923. He pushed a document toward me. Did you know the farmhouse property was originally twice as large? 24 acres, not 12? I frowned, scanning the ancient deed. No, I'd always understood it was 12 acres. That's what Grandpa always said. That's because it was reduced to 12 acres in 1972, when Dad took over management of the family finances after Great-Grandpa died. David tapped another document. He sold the eastern parcel to fund his business startup. Grandpa was apparently vehemently opposed, But Dad had power of attorney while Great-Grandpa was ill, and the sale went through. I absorbed this information slowly. You're saying Dad sold half the family property against Grandpa's wishes, before either of us was born? David nodded grimly. There's correspondence here between their attorneys. Grandpa threatened legal action, but ultimately backed down to avoid a family scandal. He never forgave Dad for it, though they maintained a surface-level relationship. The revelation cast our family history in a new light. No wonder there had always been tension between my father and grandfather, carefully masked during holiday gatherings but evident in subtle ways throughout my childhood. Why are you showing me this? Because it explains things, David said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Why Grandpa was so adamant about protecting the remaining property. Why he didn't trust Dad's judgment about the land. Why he was so suspicious of my involvement with developers. He closed the folder. And maybe why he was so determined that you should inherit. He saw in you someone who would protect what remained, not sell it off piece by piece as Dad did. I sat back, processing this revelation. You could have kept this to yourself. Used it against Dad when he pressures me to sell. I considered it, he admitted. But that would just perpetuate the cycle, wouldn't it? More secrets, more resentment, more damage to the family. This was a side of David I rarely glimpsed. Reflective, concerned with something beyond immediate advantage. What changed your mind about contesting the will? He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment before answering. Caroline, partly. She pointed out that I was becoming obsessed with controlling property that wasn't mine, just as Dad apparently did 50 years ago. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. And honestly, I read Grandpa's letter again, the copy Mr. Thompson provided for the legal review. The part about creating versus accumulating hit home. I've spent my career helping people accumulate wealth, but I've created very little of lasting value. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. That's not entirely true. You've created a family, a home for them. A house, he corrected. Not necessarily a home. There's a difference, as you clearly understand. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the farmhouse. That place was home to all of us, even though none of us lived there full time. It had, I don't know, a soul, I guess. It still does, I said quietly. And it's still part of your heritage, David. Yours and the kids. The center Grandpa envisioned isn't just for me or for the community. It's for the family, too. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. I'd like to know more about these plans. Not to interfere, he added quickly, but to understand what he wanted, what you're building. I found myself sharing the details of my meeting with Ellie and Mr. Thompson, the architectural plans, the foundation structure, the vision for preserving traditional crafts. To my surprise, David listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about the business model and sustainability plan. It could work, he acknowledged when I finished, with proper management and the right community engagement. The nonprofit structure is smart, opens doors for grants and donations that would be unavailable to a private enterprise. Would you consider serving on the foundation board? The question slipped out before I'd fully considered it, surprising. Us both. Your financial expertise would be valuable, and it would honor Grandpa's wish for family involvement. David blinked, clearly taken aback. You'd want me involved, after everything? It's not about erasing the past, I said carefully. It's about building something better for the future, something that honors what the farmhouse has meant to generations of our family. He didn't answer immediately, and I didn't press. Instead, we shifted to lighter topics. His children's school activities, my recent nursing challenges, memories of summers at the farmhouse that we both treasured despite our differences. When we finally parted ways, the tension between us had eased, replaced by a cautious but genuine willingness to move forward. "I'll think about the board position," he said as we stood in the parking lot, "and I'll talk to Dad about this history." It's time we cleared the air. "Be gentle," I advised. "Whatever happened 50 years ago, he's still our father." David nodded, an unexpected smile softening his features. "You know, you're a lot like Grandpa. Not just the eyes and that stubborn chin, but the way you see through the surface to what matters." Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity at the farmhouse. Mark Parker and his crew repaired the roof and conducted a thorough assessment of the barn's structural needs. Ellie finalized the renovation plans and secured preliminary approval from the Historic Preservation Committee. Mr. Thompson completed the paperwork for the foundation's tax-exempt status. I divided my time between nursing shifts and property management, gradually reducing my hospital hours as the project demanded more attention. My apartment in town began to feel temporary, a place to sleep rather than a home. Increasingly, I found myself staying overnight at the farmhouse, initially in my childhood bedroom, but eventually moving into the master suite that had been Grandpa's. The first significant snowfall arrived in early December, transforming the property into a winter wonderland. I stood at the kitchen window watching fat flakes drift down, coating the bare branches and blanketing the fields in pristine white. The sight stirred memories of childhood sledding adventures, snowball fights with David, and evenings by the fire while Grandpa told stories of winters long past. A gentle knock at the back door roused me from my reverie. Mrs. Parker stood on the porch, bundled in a practical wool coat and bearing a covered dish. "Thought you might appreciate some company and hot food on a snowy evening," she said, stepping inside at my invitation. The casserole, her famous chicken and wild rice, filled the kitchen with a homey aroma as it warmed in the oven. We sat at the table with mugs of tea, watching the snow through the window while she shared stories of past winters at the farmhouse. "Your grandmother used to say the first proper snow was nature's way of clearing the slate," she recalled fondly. "Making everything fresh and new for whatever comes next." I could use some of that perspective, I admitted. Everything's happening so quickly with the renovation plans. Sometimes I worry I'm missing something important, making decisions Grandpa wouldn't approve of. Mrs. Parker patted my hand with motherly understanding. "Harold trusted you for a reason, dear. He saw in you the same vision he had, an ability to honor the past while creating something meaningful for the future." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "And he knew you'd have help. No one builds a legacy alone." Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone home, the empty casserole dish wrapped carefully against the cold. No one builds a legacy alone. The truth of that statement became increasingly evident as the barn renovation progressed from plans to reality. The historic registry application was approved just before Christmas, providing both protection for the property and access to preservation grants. The foundation board took shape, with unexpected members bringing diverse perspectives. David agreed to serve as treasurer, providing financial oversight. Ellie joined to guide the architectural aspects. Tom Jensen, the master woodworker from Grandpa's contact list, offered expertise in traditional crafts, and Sarah Winters, the heritage seed specialist, developed plans for educational gardens. Most surprising was my father's gradual involvement. After David shared the discovery about the property division in 1972, I'd expected increased resistance, perhaps even hostility. Instead, my father approached the situation with uncharacteristic humility. "I made a mistake all those years ago," he acknowledged during a difficult but necessary conversation. "Prioritized my business ambitions over my father's wishes for the land." History nearly repeated itself with you and David. While he didn't join the foundation board, he offered practical support, reviewing contracts, connecting us with potential donors, even volunteering his own labor during the barn renovation. It wasn't a complete reconciliation with the past, but it was a beginning, a recognition that healing could emerge from honesty. By February, the barn transformation was well underway. The exterior had been faithfully restored to its original appearance, while the interior gradually took shape according to Ellie's designs. Each day brought new progress. Workbenches built to Tom Jensen's exacting specifications, display areas for finished pieces, classroom spaces equipped for various traditional crafts. The caretaker's apartment at the rear of the structure became my focus, a space that would eventually allow me to live on-site full-time while maintaining privacy from the center's activities. The renovations balanced modern comfort with historic character, exposed beams and original plank flooring alongside updated plumbing and efficient heating. As winter grudgingly gave way to early spring, community interest in the project grew. Local newspapers featured articles about the center. Nearby schools inquired about field trip possibilities. Artisans contacted me about teaching opportunities. What had begun as a private inheritance was evolving into a public resource, exactly as Grandpa had envisioned. My nursing colleagues organized a surprise gathering at the partially completed center, presenting me with handmade items for the display areas: quilts, carvings, pottery, each piece representing a traditional craft passed down through their families. Their support touched me deeply, a reminder that the center's mission resonated beyond my personal connection to the property. "You've found your calling," my nursing supervisor observed as we admired the group's contributions. "Not that you weren't an excellent nurse, but this, creating a space where people can connect with their heritage, learn skills that might otherwise be lost, this suits you." She was right, though I hadn't fully recognized it until that moment. The work felt purposeful in a way that transcended career or obligation. It was a vocation in the truest sense, a calling that aligned perfectly with my values and abilities. The grand opening was scheduled for the first weekend in May, when spring would be in full bloom and the property would showcase its natural beauty. As the date approached, final details fell into place. Signage installed, workshop schedules finalized, the website launched. Local vendors confirmed for the celebratory farmers market that would accompany the opening. The most meaningful preparation occurred one warm April afternoon when David arrived with Emma and Liam, their car loaded with carefully wrapped packages. "Grandpa's tools," he explained as the children helped unload. "I thought they belonged here now." The vintage woodworking tools, planes, chisels, saws, each maintained with meticulous care, had been Grandpa's pride. Seeing them return to the property, destined for use in teaching rather than sitting unused in David's garage, felt like coming full circle. "There's something else," David said after the tools had been arranged in their designated space. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, similar to the one Mr. Thompson had given me months earlier. "I found this in Grandpa's toolbox. It has your name on it." The box was exquisite, cherry wood polished to a warm glow, with an inlaid design of dogwood blossoms on the lid. My name was burned into the bottom in Grandpa's distinctive script. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a delicate silver pendant, a tree of life design suspended from a fine chain. "There's a note," David said, pointing to a folded paper tucked into the lid. The message was brief but powerful. "For Jenny, on the day the center opens. Your grandmother wore this pendant at our wedding and on every significant day thereafter. She would be proud to see it continue its journey with you as you bring new life to our family's legacy. With love and confidence, Grandpa." Tears blurred my vision as David helped fasten the chain around my neck. The pendant rested just above my heart, a tangible connection to my grandmother whom I'd adored but lost too early in life. "It suits you," David said quietly. "The whole place does. Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing when he chose you." The morning of the opening dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the occasion. I rose early, too excited to sleep, and walked the property in the first light of day. The farmhouse gleamed with fresh paint, windows sparkling in the sunrise. The barn, now officially the Miller Heritage Arts Center, stood proudly restored, its weathered red siding, complemented by new black trim and polished brass hardware. Between the two structures, volunteers had created paths lined with perennials from Grandma's original gardens: peonies, iris, bleeding hearts, each plant divided and propagated over decades until her flowers bloomed throughout the county in the gardens of friends and family who had received her generous divisions. As I completed my circuit of the property, I noticed my father's car coming up the drive, unusually early for the day's events. He emerged carrying a large flat package wrapped in brown paper and secured with twine. His expression was solemn, almost nervous, as he approached. "I wanted to give you this before everyone arrives," he said, holding out the package. "It belongs here." I unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph I'd never seen before, my grandparents standing proudly in front of the newly built barn in 1948, their faces young and full of hope. The quality was remarkable for its age, the details crisp and clear despite the passage of 77 years. "Where did you find this?" I asked, studying the image that captured a moment long before my birth. "In my father's things after. He died," my father admitted. "I kept it even though—" He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "Even though our relationship was complicated, he loved this place in a way I never fully understood until recently. Watching you these past months, seeing what you've created here, it's helped me understand what he was trying to preserve." The admission clearly cost him something in pride, but offered something greater in return, a kind of peace that had eluded him for decades. "Thank you," I said softly. "This will hang in a place of honor." By mid-morning, the property was transformed by activity, vendors setting up booths, musicians tuning instruments on the small stage near the garden, volunteers arranging chairs for the opening ceremony. David arrived with his family, Emma immediately racing to the children's craft area while Liam investigated every corner of the barn with boundless curiosity. Caroline joined me as I made final adjustments to the display of Grandpa's woodworking, tools. "It's magnificent, Jenny. Better than any of us imagined when you first described the plans." "It's evolved beyond what even I imagined," I admitted. "It's become something that belongs to the community as much as to our family." She smiled, watching as David demonstrated the proper use of a hand plane to an attentive group of teenagers. "That's what makes it special. It's not just preserved, it's alive." The formal ribbon cutting was scheduled for noon, but by 11 the property was already filled with visitors, families exploring the educational exhibits, seniors sharing memories of traditional crafts they'd learned in their youth, children participating in hands-on activities guided by local artisans. As the appointed hour approached, I found myself surrounded by those who had made the center possible: family, friends, community members who had contributed time, resources, and expertise to bring Grandpa's vision to life. Mrs. Parker stood beside me, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. David and his family formed a supportive semicircle to my right. My parents, tentative but present, waited to my left. The crowd gathered around the main entrance to the barn, where a blue ribbon stretched across the doorway. Mr. Thompson handed me the ceremonial scissors with a nod of approval. "Harold would be proud," he said simply. I had prepared remarks for the occasion, but as I faced the assembled community, the formal speech seemed inadequate. Instead, I spoke from the heart. My grandfather believed that our heritage isn't something frozen in the past, but a living resource that guides our future. The skills taught here, woodworking, quilting, gardening, food preservation, aren't just hobbies. They're connections to generations of knowledge, to sustainability, to the satisfaction of creating with our own hands. I glanced around at the faces before me. Neighbors, family, strangers united by shared values. This center belongs to all of us. It exists to preserve what's valuable from our collective past while creating new traditions for the future. In that spirit, I invite everyone to be not just visitors but participants in what we're building here. As I cut the ribbon and applause erupted, I felt the weight of Grandma's pendant against my heart. A reminder that legacies aren't measured in property or possessions, but in values transmitted, in wisdom shared, in love that extends beyond a single lifetime. The center flourished beyond our expectations in the years that followed. Workshops filled to capacity, the calendar expanding to accommodate growing interest in traditional crafts. The caretaker's apartment became my permanent home, allowing me to be fully present for both scheduled activities and the quiet moments between. Dawn walks through dew-soaked fields, twilight hours on the porch watching fireflies rise from the Eats meadow. David surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by developing a genuine passion for woodworking. What began as occasional weekend visits with his children evolved into regular participation in advanced classes. His financial expertise, balancing perfectly with newfound creativity. The toolbox he crafted for Emma's 10th birthday, dovetail joints perfectly fitted, her name inlaid in contrasting woods, would have earned Grandpa's wholehearted approval. My parents found their own connections to the center, my father documenting the property's history through interviews with longtime community members. My mother coordinating seasonal celebrations that honored traditional observances of planting, harvest, and winter preparations. 5 years after the opening, on a perfect autumn day, much like the one when Grandpa's will had been read, I sat on the porch swing watching golden leaves drift across the lawn. Beside me, Mrs. Parker worked on a quilt square for the community, project hanging in the center's main hall. In the distance, I could see David teaching Liam how to split kindling for the evening's bonfire, his movements patient and precise. "Your grandfather is looking down mighty pleased right now," Mrs. Parker observed, securing a particularly delicate stitch. "Everything he hoped for, and then some." I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of Grandma's pendant against my heart. Sometimes I wonder if he knew exactly how it would unfold. The family coming together around the property instead of being divided by it. "Oh, he knew," she said with quiet certainty. "Harry understood people better than they understood themselves. Sometimes. He saw the strength in you when others missed it, recognized the potential in David that needed the right outlet, even anticipated your parents' eventual reconciliation with the past." Her words resonated with truth. The inheritance hadn't been solely about property or possessions. It had been about healing family wounds that had festered for generations, about creating something that would bring us together rather than drive us apart. As twilight settled over the farmhouse, visitors departed and family gathered for our traditional Sunday dinner. The conversation flowed easily around the old oak table, Emma describing her latest art project, Liam recounting a school achievement, my parents and David discussing plans for the center's winter program. I looked around at these familiar faces illuminated by candlelight and realized that this moment of connection, of shared purpose despite our differences, was Grandpa's true legacy. Not the buildings or the land, but the values they represented, the community they fostered, the family they helped heal. In his final letter, Grandpa had written that some inheritances can't be measured in dollars or acres, that some are built of sturdier stuff, principles, memories, and the courage to protect what truly matters. Sitting among those I loved in the home that had sheltered generations, I understood completely. The greatest inheritance wasn't what had been given to me, but what together we were passing on, a living legacy that would continue long after we were gone. Just as the farmhouse had endured through joy and sorrow, abundance and hardship, always providing shelter for both bodies and souls. Outside, the first star appeared in the deepening blue of evening. Inside, laughter warmed the ancient walls that had witnessed a century of family stories. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was exactly as it should be, exactly as Grandpa had intended all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.